Hi, I'm Courtney.
And I'm Beth.
Welcome to Dead Reckoning, the podcast where death isn't the end of the story.
Today we're talking to Amy Shea, the author of a new book, Too Poor to Die, The Hidden Realities of Dying in the Margins. I'm going to read a quick intro. Her work has appeared in the Missouri Review, Panegyrus, Portland Review, the Massachusetts Review, and the Journal of Sociology of Health and Illness. She works as the writing project director for the Mount Tamalpais College, a free community college for incarcerated people of San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I thought we would start by having you read a little bit from the book.
Yeah, so I'm happy to read from the book. This is from the chapter called Assaying on the Anxiety of Positionality, and it's the second chapter in the book. The chapter itself dives pretty deep into positionality, right? My position as a researcher and a writer, but the first couple pages of this chapter really sort of sets the scene and gives some context for really it's kind of almost the thesis of the book in a way, and what really kind of brought me into it. So I'll just read a couple pages. Over the years, while living in Somerville, I couldn't help but notice a man I'd come to think of as Somerville Mike. Living in Metro Boston, I regularly took mass transit, and over time, I'd come to recognize him as someone who occasionally got on the bus along the route I took down Somerville Ave. He was always slightly hunched over, his close-shaved hair beginning to bald in the front, and he was missing a handful of teeth, which could be seen when he would smile. Sometimes he liked to wave and yell, "Hello," to both children and adults. Most times the adults looked right through him, some made eye contact or smiled, but no one ever waved back. Other times Mike would get on the bus and begin shouting loudly, seemingly distressed, his words unintelligible, garbled. Again, most took no notice. I mostly saw him on the bus, but occasionally I'd catch glimpses of him walking around town, seeming to stick to a 1-mile radius. He was never stemming, begging for spare change. Usually I'd just see him wandering around or sitting on the sidewalk or a bench somewhere along Somerville Ave. Sometimes talking to himself, sometimes just staring ahead, always alone. He usually wore sweatpants that would be falling down, the crack of his butt sticking out. And he never carried any belongings with him and never seemed much dressed against the cold or the heat one way or the other. Based on his behavior, I assumed he had a cognitive disability of some kind. I also assumed that he was being looked after, possibly in a group home. I was wrong. One night we were sitting in our local pub when Mike came in. He was yelling at the bartender, Matt, asking him for money for cigarettes. Matt shook his head. "Mike, you can't stay in here." $1? Mike asked, shouting back. Matt shook his head again, then gently placed his hands onto Mike's shoulders and guided him out. "You can bum one of my cigarettes," he said, as they walked out the door together, with Mike repeating, $1? As they went. When Matt came back in, I asked, "Does he live in a group home nearby?" Matt laughed. "No, he's homeless." I felt a fool for not knowing this. Matt went on to explain that Mike was the way he was because he was beaten severely as a baby and child, which had left him brain damaged. That story was heartbreaking enough, but was made worse for the same reason I didn't assume he was homeless. I just couldn't believe someone who'd been so mentally disabled for most of his life had been left on his own. At this point, the focus of my research and writing was on general attitudes on death and dying, such as exploring how to die well, how to talk more openly about end-of-life wishes, or how to have a more environmentally friendly burial. But seeing Mike's situation brought up so many questions for me and problematized the research and assumptions I'd held around death and dying. What happened if Mike got sick or injured? Would he get medical care? Would that care be consistent? Did his inability to readily communicate and his combative nature isolate and alienate him from services? Would he ultimately be one of those who died on the streets and ended up buried nameless in a potter's field, like the ones I'd seen in Fresno that had initially sent me on this death and dying knowledge quest? Mike is an extreme example, yet the image of him burrowed under my skin and I couldn't forget him. I'd been thinking about the inequities faced by people living on the streets for years before I encountered Somerville Mike. But it was only just before that I'd begun thinking about those inequities within the framework of the U.S. healthcare system and what such disparity meant for someone approaching the end of their lives. Death is supposed to be the great equalizer, the thing we all experience, regardless of our class, race, or any other identities we've held or experiences we've had in life. Yet not all deaths are created equal. Not everyone has a good or a dignified death or is treated with respect and dignity once dead.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
So I wanted to start by asking you, and maybe this is the part you just read is part of your origin story, but where did your interest in death care and death care for the poor begin?
Do you want the short version or the long version?
Whatever feels right to you.
Give us the long version, Amy.
Okay, I'll do that. It started in 2012 when my grandmother died. She was the last of my grandparents to pass, which you think, okay, well, you've done this and whatever. But I was in my early 30s. She was probably the closest grandparent I'd had, and also the most recent one to die as an adult. And I had just moved to Scotland about 2 weeks before to start my MFA when she died. But I'd been kind of involved in just a lot of communication from my dad leading up to that. And I think what really struck me is that, she died and I couldn't believe how sad I felt. And I'll qualify this. And I was having grief dreams. And I wrote about this in my MFA work because I just did not feel entitled to that grief. I was like, she's an elderly grandparent. Like, it wasn't shocking, she was in her 80s. But I think what was really striking me was that I was in my 30s and had been so lightly touched by death that I'd never felt that kind of grief before. And at the same time all that was happening, right around then, I'd gone to visit the county cemetery with my dad in Fresno, where he was doing his work and learning about sort of unclaimed or more hidden deaths. And I was volunteering at homeless shelters and sort of kind of all these things. Like, I think as a writer and especially as an essayist, I'm constantly like just observing those threads and those connections. And when the universe starts speaking to you like that, you're like, wait a minute. And so it just sort of all happened that they came together, and I was falling into this. I first went into death positivity kind of from all the grief and everything else, and found all these books and these articles and started really digging into it. But I just was having trouble just focusing on that when I was thinking, wait, there's so many people who aren't part of this conversation, who can't even think about having a green burial, let alone like being buried somewhere where they would want to be or having any agency or choice at all. And I had a writing professor once say to me, write where the heat is. And I think all writers do this naturally, but that line was so visceral and always stayed with me. And I think that's just what I was doing. That's where the heat was. I couldn't leave it alone. And I'd written an essay in my MFA program in 2013. I wrote another essay that was even longer in 2015. And I took that to a writing workshop, and somebody said, that's a really interesting essay, but it's not an essay. It's a book.
Oh, wow.
And then off the deep end we went.
Don't you love it when people say that to you and you're like, no.
You're like, no.
I don't have time for a book.
And that's why I went back and got a doctorate. I had to go pay somebody to write that book, to give me time to go write that book.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Fresno Cemetery and the work your dad was doing and how you got started tagging along with him?
Yeah, so in his retirement, he started working for the Genealogy Society at the library there in Fresno. And the project he devoted his time to was mapping all of the cemeteries in Fresno County. So he was going to, cemetery directors and trying to get maps and old records and creating this giant database that basically if someone came and said, I'm looking for great-great-granddad, they could potentially point and say, he's here.
It's noble work.
Yes.
Yeah, and so many people that age when they retire go into genealogy, right? Like my father-in-law is super into this, but this is like a whole new, it's like public service genealogy in a way that's not creepy, like the Mormon temple. Sorry, I don't know if anybody's Mormon, but like he found a way to take that passion and turn it into something that's actually like very useful for a lot of people, not just people in his own family. I love that story.
Yeah, and it's funny, he became really friendly with the cemetery director of the Armenian cemetery there, Ararat Armenian Cemetery, and she calls him the cemetery fairy because he just came in and sprinkled his magic dust and like found all these things and was able to, and so in his process of doing that though, I don't remember how it came about, but someone from the county, from the coroner's department basically said, we have these boxes in the basement in a corner piled up, and it's all these old records of people who were buried in the county cemeteries. And along with it, so he took that, but along with that, they were struggling to find space. They were running out of space. And well, my dad in his career leading up to retirement had been a surveyor. So him and a buddy of his who he used to work with, they went out and found them a few more plots. And each plot in Fresno in the county cemetery holds about 450 cremated remains.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so that bought them a little bit more time and a little bit more space. And honestly, to this day, we'll go out there and he'll say he can see all these other areas where they could put more space in if they wanted to, but it's a whole other thing. But, he was doing this, and I was living in Boston at the time, and I would go home to visit periodically. And I started going with him, partly because my dad and I weren't like emotionally close, I think, for a long time. And it was like, this was a way for us to do something together. So we bonded over death.
To connect, yeah.
Like you do. To my mother's despair. But, and he first took me out and he would show me where all the plots are for like great-grandparents, like random cousins, etc. He wanted to like make sure I knew where that stuff was. So when he was gone, that was still kept in the family. But then when he was talking about these Potter's Fields or county cemeteries, I'm like, the heck is that? And I think it's the same reaction that so many people I talk to have when I talk about this. They're like, say what again? That happened? I had someone say, I thought that was something that happened like back in the day.
In the 1800s or something, right? You're like, nowadays.
And you think of mass like graves as something that happens in wartime or with, like illness, or not something that is a government system that is, and then you realize like it's not as common. I think initially I thought, oh, wow, this is what every county does. And then you realize, of course, not every county is as big as Fresno. Obviously Los Angeles does something similar. It's very different all around. But yeah, that was my first kind of intro into it. And it just really just blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that begins to answer my next question, which is, and it's different everywhere. What happens when someone who is poor or quote unquote unclaimed dies?
How long do
you have to read the book to find out, you guys.
So one of the things I've done since getting into all of this was I started a group called the Equitable Disposition Alliance. And we're just a ragtag bunch of folks who, we we met during COVID online and we started talking, and we now have funding from the Order of the Good Death to create a publicly shared database trying to gather this information. What happened? And we're trying on a smaller scale as far as let's do 2 counties or regions per state is our kind of our goal. Oh boy. And this is what's really difficult about this. It is so hard to get this information. As someone who's looking and trying really hard and who has the time and who's not grieving and who's not trying to prepare for whatever, it's so difficult to find. But the short answer is it depends. But the more robust answer is that if you are unclaimed in death, and I use the word unclaimed as a broad term,
yeah,
it really means sort of financially unclaimed. It could mean someone who is unidentified, which is very rare these days. It could mean someone who is, of course, identifiable, but they can't find any next of kin and there's no financial resources available. Or it's someone who's identified but has family who says no thanks,
Mhm.
didn't like him when he was alive, and there's no money. And so there's lots of different reasons, like someone might end up in a kind of county, like being handled by a county disposition program. But each county does it slightly different, and it's first and foremost guided by state law. And that's partly why this is so tricky. There's no national, like federal law so each state does it differently. And then underneath that, each county or region, whatever it might be, does it differently. They have to follow kind of those minimum guidelines of whatever the state says. But then from there, depending on who's in charge, what kind of resources they have, how big of an issue this is for them, it's different. So in California, state law, for instance, if a body comes in and it's unclaimed for any one of those reasons, they have to hold it for 30 days. Now, my understanding is if they find family or next of kin before those 30 days are up, I think they only have to hold it for 10 to 18. But for instance, when I was speaking to Napa County, they will still hold it the full 30 days.
Mm.
They won't, rush it. And then again, it's going to depend on how much resource they have to dedicate to trying to find people. And the coroner's doing stuff, but then the public administrator is the person who's going to go look for financial resources and bank accounts and all that type of thing.
Right. And even in my limited research, it seems like a lot of jurisdictions maybe don't try as hard as they could and don't use all the resources that are available to them. They might go through public records, but they might not go through social media, for example.
Yeah, and Beth, we just had that situation in San Francisco not too long ago where they notified the wrong next of kin.
Yeah.
And it basically had to do with they did not do a thorough investigation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, what I write about in the book is with Fresno, back when we went to the mass memorial, the memorial that they had back in 2018, they put a call out. So they, first of all, missed one. They were supposed to kind of be doing them every 4 to 5 years, and it ended up being 9 years. So instead of having 450 folks to bury, they had 800. And they put a call out 3 weeks before, I think maybe in the newspaper and maybe on their website. They were able to clear like 60 folks who were able to come and be claimed by family. But if you come to claim them, you have to pay, right? So in Fresno, for instance, you've got to pay about $250. You're just paying for the county back for the cremation cost if you want to take those like cremated remains with you. Once they're interred, though, in Fresno, that's it. There's no coming back out. Whereas in Denver, if you get interred and someone comes out of the woodwork 10 years later, they will work to get those remains back out of and give them to the family. So again, I think it partly just depends on who's in charge and what kind of resources and time they have. And I don't blame individuals. It's not like there are these bad folks. I think it's people are overworked, underpaid, and it's a systemic problem.
Issue.
Yeah.
I can't remember which chapter it was in your book, Amy, but when you talked about trying to find out about how in Boston unclaimed remains are disposed of, that was wild. I was reading that and I was thinking, because it took you, I don't even remember how long, just to get a very simple answer. Okay, it wasn't a simple answer. It was a complicated answer, which is maybe why. But do you want to talk about that a little bit? Like just the bureaucracy involved in trying to find out what even is the rule? Where do people go? Where are they?
Yeah, it's so hidden. And I think that really struck me, and partly why I write about all of this. In some ways, it's like, oh, well, it's a quest narrative. I'm on this journey, and I want to take the reader on that journey because I want people to understand how difficult this information can be to come across. And with Boston, again, it partly was going into it. I only at that point had exposure to what Fresno and LA did. And so I was just going off of that. And I didn't know where to look. And I remember thinking, I'll just go to the library. And the librarian's like, no idea. She said, try Mount Auburn Cemetery. And anyone who knows Mount Auburn Cemetery is probably laughing right now because it is like, one of the
no poor people there. Yeah.
No poor people there. But I thought, she's like, but just go because they're so historic. They might have knowledge. And I write about in the book, that guy basically turned his nose up at me and laughed me out of the room. And the only way I found it was because I ended up going to memorial service for homeless people, asking questions and randomly finding the right persons. And then I was a member of the writers' room of Boston, and there was a journalist there, and she said, "Oh, there are a couple of articles. Go check these out." And those things all came together, and I was able to find it out. But some of that was just luck. Some of that was having the time to go do these things and talk to people, and just all of it. And with the Equitable Disposition Alliance, I'm going to say EDA from now on. With the EDA, we have a whole talking sheet that we give volunteers. We have a list of questions, and we call places, and we now know, right? Try the coroner, or if it's underneath the sheriff, etc. Maybe don't start with the head honcho. Start with someone lower down they might be more likely or able to talk to you. If they can't answer questions, try the public administrator. But even then, like when I've called places, I've gotten questions like, well, after talking to my boss and our lawyers, we're concerned about who this information is for, what you're going to do with it. Basically, who are you, why you want this.
Yeah, we don't want anyone to know.
But it's public information. I had one person say, well, just basically go pull a FOIA. Go get a Freedom of Information Act if you want to know. And then we talked a little bit more, and I said, look, it's just going on a database, shared with people, so if they need to find someone, et cetera. She said, well, I can tell you what I would tell a family member if they called up and asked. But, and you're right, and it's just, so there's so much bureaucracy, and it's like, who do I talk to? And then will they even talk to me? And yeah. And even just trying to find the cemeteries alone, like where are people being interred?
It's like they want it to be hidden, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a through line, I think, of all of our work, right? They want it to be hidden. They don't want we as a culture, we as a culture don't want to think about it, don't want to know about it, already people we don't care about. And then when they die, we care even less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of my questions for you, Amy, is really like, how much of this obfuscation is like lack of resources versus really not wanting the public to know what happens to people who die on the margins?
I know. It's a great question. I couldn't give you a real concrete, like, I know that this is why this is happening. I feel like it's both of those things. Yeah. And I think it's I think part of it is, as Courtney was saying, is like, there's some of it just societally. I think even like when I spoke with one and they when they asked, said, go get a FOIA and all this other stuff, she eventually told me what they did. And it was actually like pretty respectful and it wasn't that bad. But I wonder if there's just some internalized shame, even if, again, it's like they made an effort. Like if they found financial resources for someone, but they couldn't find next of kin, they would look and try to find a family plot somewhere and get them buried in that cemetery rather than in the county cemetery. So I think, well, that's actually like a pretty kind, empathetic thing to do. But there's still some aspect, I think you're right, of like, well, we don't want to talk about, like, if you go to the Fresno County Cemetery, for instance, it's not pretty, right? Yeah. And there's not a lot of effort being made to you're not memorializing anyone beyond a number, et cetera. And so maybe there's some shame there. But I also do think there is just the sheer bureaucracy of people being, there's a lot coming in that they have to deal with. And this, is maybe not always the priority.
Yeah.
And their death is kind of a lot of times at the end of a long list of ways that we have failed these people in life. Yeah. The government, maybe their families, but like all of us, right? Mm-hmm. So talking about it is also kind of like, we have to face the fact that it's a societal failure on all of our parts too. It's uncomfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go back to something you said a few minutes ago about how there's no like federal standard for disposition of people who die in poverty. Would it be helpful to have a federal standard, and is there any effort being made to try to do that? Or
that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if having a federal standard would bring it into the light anymore than it already, or if it would just make it worse with more red tape potentially. Yeah. So maybe it's not a thing of needing to do that, but it making it more visible, I think, for us, even some of the questions I ask when I'm doing work for the EDA is, I just want some basic information. How long do you hold someone while you're looking for next of kin? What kind of disposition method do you use? And where do you inter bodies? And is there any public financial assistance? I'm like, we have other questions, but I'm like, at the bare minimum, I just want to know those things. Because that's what a family member is going to need to know. They just need to know the basics.
Yeah.
It's almost like you might need like a model, like a uniform statute that the states can adopt, because, this is something that's in the purview of the states, death, safety, things like that. So, but like a model, some type of model code, right?
Yeah. Then the National Healthcare the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council has models for medical respite care units, for instance, right? Here are the guidelines for how to create a medical respite center in your neighborhood. I think having something like that, because each individual county, part of the issue is, a tiny little town of 10,000 people or something is not going to need this in the same way a city as big as Boston is, or Fresno. But having some basic guidelines, and there's also how to share that information. I think more than anything, how do you just make this a little bit more public? And I think the effort being made to point to the other part of your question, Beth, is I think it's people like us who are all talking about it. I don't think there's any real organized effort, but I think there's a need to raise awareness around this for that reason. I think people you can't care about something you don't know about. And I think a lot of people just don't even, this is so not in their frame of reference at all.
Yeah.
And get more people thinking, what happens to the people in your community who die unclaimed? And wanting to, then maybe you get more people getting involved and wanting to make some change.
Yeah. On this podcast already, Courtney and I have talked quite a lot about the differences that exist between rich and poor, whites and non-whites, and how they're cared for in death in very unequal ways. Is this something you think we've always had as a culture, or how did we get here?
If we want to go back.
Take us back,
Take
Amy.
us back. Sure, right? This is one of the issues with homelessness and healthcare inequality and all this is the systemic racism. This lack of access and to quality healthcare. And we talked about, I think Courtney might have said earlier, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone just didn't end up unclaimed in death. There was a long list of grievances and things that happened before that led to that. And so, I think it's been a problem probably since this country was founded. Let's go back to the original sin of slavery. I think absolutely. There is just and you look at homelessness, and some of that goes back to redlining and other things of people's homes being taken away from them, and that lack of generational wealth, and lack of access to all kinds of things, education, healthcare, nutritious foods, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that unfortunately that is, again, why I always think when you're talking to just an individual person at the county, they're not the bad people.
Yeah.
We are just
they did
not invent any of this, but we are entrenched in this system, and it's really hard to get out of it. Especially when you're a public employee.
Yeah, and I think you had a quote in your book where you talked about, and I'm gonna butcher this quote. I know it's like a famous quote about show us how you treat the dead, and I'll show you how you treat the living.
Yeah.
And I come from a criminal justice reform background, and we say that about prisoners, right?
Uh-huh.
Show us how you treat your worst, the people you consider to be the worst in your society, and I'll tell you what you think about everyone else. And,
right.
And the issue with the death is it's symbolic of everything that came before and of all the other systems that are in place to keep people suffering.
Yeah. And it's like you say with that quote and with incarceration, I mean, incarceration, homelessness, and death are all very hidden things in our society. And if you're not, and if there's no sense of responsibility to do right upon the people who aren't being seen by everyone else, like, there's a lot to question there.
Yeah.
Right.
Writ large today, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really appreciated in your book, you talked about ways that are acceptable or unacceptable to have a body, especially in public, and things that homeless people have to do in public that make them more visible, but then also make people treat them differently. And like, again, the way that it's okay or not okay to have a body, both when you're alive and when you die. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's funny though, that is all in, a lot of that is in chapter 1, although I think that some of it's in another chapter as well. And those were initially 2 separate chapters, and I was just thinking about, and they were things I was thinking about separately initially, right? It's like when you look at where cemeteries like that are county cemeteries, like the Fresno County Cemetery, granted, they are in the same area as a lot of other cemeteries, but even that is interesting. They're all pushed to the side.
Even the cemeteries, they wanted out.
They're
right?
out.
Yeah.
They're literally on the other side of the tracks in Fresno. And then the county cemetery and the Chinese cemetery that's no longer used, but there's obviously still people interred in there. They're 2 of them are side by side in Fresno, and you can't even see them. Like when you're, you just drive by and you don't even know they're there. And so there's this like pushing to the outskirts of town. And the same thing happens oftentimes with homeless shelters, right? They're put in places that are not within reach of the resources that you need to actually sustain yourself and, find ways to be successful and have community and do all of these things. And those things were all kind of coming together. And then I actually interviewed some hospice workers at a physical hospice center in the UK. It was so interesting to talk to them because, they have socialized healthcare. And they're like, yeah, of course we can take homeless people here. Like we can take anybody. But when I was talking to one man that worked there, he said, well, the issues we've had occasionally homeless people or people who have been in house who've come to us, and they don't want to stay there because it's so far away from where all their friends are and their community that they're not going to come to see them. And so now they're isolated. And so it wasn't really accessible, even though technically it was. And so I think there's all of that. And I think it was also then looking at homelessness and things like encampments and sweeps and whatnot. And you just are starting to see this parallelism or this mirroring of just the people who are seen as less than or undeserving or unproductive in our capitalist society are pushed out and told you can be here, but you can't be here.
Yeah.
Yep.
And, with unhoused people, like I read a book, again, this was in London, and this reporter was going around interviewing people. And at one point she wanted to take someone to a cafe. And this guy was like, I do not want to go in there. Right. Because they're all going to look at me and be like, what
and he's maybe been kicked out of there before. Right.
Right. And so, and again, like even just the piece I read, like when Somerville Mike came into the pub, Matt was like, you can't be in here, dude.
Yeah.
I could have gone in there and sat in there and not bought a drink and no one would have kicked me out, but not him. And why? What's the difference there? And so I think it is that. So just, and that's why inevitably I ended up putting those things in the same chapter, because I was like, there is just this whole conversation about where we are allowed to exist. And I think as women, we know this too, all too well. But it was a question I couldn't leave out, and it had to be brought into that conversation.
I love how you described it too, about the like unruly body, like the body that can't be tamed. Well, like none of our bodies can be, but we have bathrooms, we have kitchens, we have beds that like everyone needs to sleep, eat, and shit, right? But if you have nowhere to go, it necessarily happens in public. I think if more people thought about it that way, maybe it could evoke some compassion.
Well, and it was that I forgetting the full name of the article, but it's talking about the sequestered body, and it's like the shitful body or something like that. And she's just talking about people who are housed, people who have resources, but she gives these examples, and especially the woman who goes into a hospice and could not control her bowels because of her disease. And how she just eventually got shoved and she was so ashamed, and her family stopped visiting. And there's just this, just shove her in the closet till she dies, basically. And this is someone who still even had a room, who still had a place where she could privately do that. Yeah. And she's even being pushed to the margins. Now you're in public dealing with that. And you, like you said, you don't have the bedroom, the bed, the bathroom to use.
Yeah, I see a lot of this discourse in San Francisco where people are like, why can't these people just use a bathroom somewhere? And it's like, where are you supposed to go?
Yeah, you're like, where? Exactly. Like, there's so many.
Have
right?
any of you ever been like wandering around the city and being like, oh no, where is there going to be a public bathroom that I can use?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think about that all the time. And I always think, even like, if I need to, I will go into that Starbucks and pay and buy a drink and go use the bathroom.
Yes.
But like, even that like strikes fear in me, and this is a temporary situation.
Yeah.
And if I can just digress a little bit, one of the things that came up recently, I sat in on a National Healthcare for the Homeless Council meeting, and they were talking about aging into homelessness, and they were talking about like people who are unhoused chronically get diseases and get illnesses and things far younger of it, like in their 50s, that they would be getting in their 70s maybe normally. And one of the big ones is incontinence. And the part of the reason for that is they can't properly, what they call toilet, right? Like toileting habits. They can't find a bathroom regularly. They have a lot, and this creates this chronic issue that then they now have to deal with potentially in their 50s.
Yeah.
And that really like struck a chord, because I thought, again, I'm like, who can't? And that's one thing they tell me about, is like why I use the body to some extent. We all have bodies and we all know what it feels like to be in them. Who cannot remember one time where you've been like, oh my God, I have to pee so bad and I'm going to die, and where am I going to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, and how many of us, like maybe when we were young and irresponsible, peed in some bushes when we were out drinking, and we weren't worried about getting arrested or like chased away, because you have the privilege of being clearly housed, and it's the same thing essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about, and I don't know if this relates or not, but we also have these ideas about dead bodies, like, that they are contagious or dangerous, or, I mean, yeah, it can get gross, right? If as bodies decay, but there's like a big unwillingness to accept that. Yeah. And then, I mean, it translates into this, I guess, this kind of like disgust for, and prevents us from talking about it and being realistic about it and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, as a culture, like, we do so many things to suppress what our bodies naturally do in the name of polite society. And then we turn around and criticize anybody who doesn't have the option to do that. So,
and you think, I mean, again, like you said, we don't really have control over our bodies. We just think we do. And then most of the time, maybe it does, or, a chunk of the time it does what we want it to do. And then there are other times it doesn't.
Many times.
Many such
cases, yeah.
I'm actually going to say for me, it's maybe skewing more the other direction, especially getting into middle age. But,
relatable.
Yeah. So and I just think like that's why I keep coming back to that, because I think maybe that's a way to get people to empathize, because when you can embody something literally and think about it from a physical standpoint, it's harder to ignore.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember clearly being in the Westfield Shopping Center in San Francisco when my daughter was like 1 or 2 years old. And there was somebody there who I think was probably unhoused, and he was just like leaning against one of the planters and falling asleep. And I was like, as someone who is also getting no sleep, I totally relate to like, you're just passing out for a nap right here. And it got me thinking so much about like the terrible sleep that people are probably getting when they're homeless, like
Yeah, imagine
interruptions,
how
no
that
deep
ages
sleep.
you. Yeah.
Right. You don't sleep well, and part of that, right, is self-preservation. If you
Yeah.
fall too deeply asleep, something bad could happen to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember talking to a guy at the foot care clinic, and he said, "I don't take my shoes off when I sleep because people steal them from you."
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and things like that. And yeah, and actually, even like incarceration, it's the same thing. They actually had someone come into San Quentin recently and do a talk on sleep deprivation, and every student was like, "Yeah, no shit."
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
they leave the lights on, right? They're like, it's
and there's just constant noise, and you know, there's all, and so it's, I think there's similarities there, and it's amazing because we are learning so much about how I feel like a lot of our health all comes back to sleep and the quality of sleep, and you're just not getting quality sleep when you're on the streets, and even in a shelter. And shelters can be even worse actually than being on, like, rough sleeping, as they call it, right?
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
This kind of brings me to my next question, which is that I feel like in San Francisco and across California, we're seeing like an increase in anti-poverty laws and like you can't have your tent. San Francisco just made a 2-hour parking limit for RVs, so people are not allowed to live in their RVs. Can you talk about why these do not work as a deterrent to poverty and might leave more people worse off?
Yeah, it's it's amazing. I've noticed that too. And part of that, I don't know what year it was now, it was very recent. The Supreme Court passed a law that basically could allow, you know, camping to not be allowed, right? And then you see this sort of the pendulum swinging and this backlash of letting people camp. And every time you do a sweep and you move people on, belongings get lost. And that could be important medications, driver's license, birth certificates, all these things you need so that when you get fined for being on the street and you have to go to court and you have to have all these things, you don't have them. And now you're getting a poor tax basically on top of that. You're now going to get fined for not showing up to court. And you're talking about someone who already doesn't have any money and you're fining them for these things that, I mean, and the question I always have when you hear this, look, I get it, right? I understand. I understand it from both sides, but like at the same time, where are these people supposed to go? You just moving them on isn't solving the problem. You're not helping people get jobs. You're not helping people get into stable housing with services. You're just making it someone else's problem, and you're compounding their problems by, I mean, imagine the amount, who loves to move? It's, you know, it's not enjoyable ever. And now you're trying to take everything you physically own and shift it somewhere else, and in the process, potentially losing things. And one of the things I talk about in the book that in doing research, I learned about, you know, is people might leave or they're afraid to leave because if a sweep happens while they're gone, they lose all their stuff. So then people don't go to health care appointments. They don't go to doctor's appointments. They don't go because they're afraid to go. And so there's the consequence of going and having all these things happen. And then there's also those consequences of not leaving and living your life and doing the things you need to do to, you know, get out of your situation. So all it really does is drive people further into poverty, further into poor health. You know, you're causing massive amounts of stress and trauma and anxiety. And again, we all know what those do to our bodies. And it's just, it's just a piling on.
And you're right, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
At the end of the day, if like somehow, you know, it worked, but it doesn't. And also, we're just disappearing these people. We're just moving them around, right? Like any mayor can come in and clean up one street for whoever's coming to town, but then they're just 2 blocks over. Like nothing is changing.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, that's it. I think it's like somewhere in like Naples, Florida or something. They actually will put them into buses and ship them to the town next door.
Yep. They've done that here. Yeah.
And I just think it's funny because I don't know if I can actually qualify this with research, but I feel like this is something that I heard. I mean, well, I can qualify the first part in that a lot of this started with the Reagan administration, right? But then there was talk.
No argument here.
No argument
there.
But then I think there was like this. I've heard stories that they would give people bus tickets to California, like out of like hospitals and things, and be like, go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they have documented incidences of sheriffs driving people across county lines to cities, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Not to mention, San Francisco, have a large and visible homeless population, partly because this is where the resources are. And so you, of course, from the neighboring areas, if you're living in San Mateo, there might not be like a shelter or a housing program or whatever it is that you need, or the police might be harder on them. So they come here, which gives them access to services, but then we're also absorbing these populations from everywhere, and then we get blamed for it, right?
Yeah.
Criticized for it because
I'm
it's
sure
visible.
Alamo and Danville don't have homeless shelters.
No, girl. They're driving them over the border. Yeah.
I was going to say one other outcome of the sweeps, and I think this was true, particularly the Super Bowl sweeps, but others as well, is that when you force people into a different neighborhood, they're not dealing with their usual dealers, and they might be taking a different dose of something than they're supposed to, and overdoses have gone up when those things have happened because people are not getting the same drug mixture that they're accustomed to.
Wow. That is news. I did not know that.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It does make sense. Yeah.
Well, also you have a community around you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If it's under a bridge, it's still a community.
Mm-hmm.
You know who's around you. We're humans are social creatures.
Yeah, there was one I just saw on the news a while back, and I can't remember where it was. Maybe somewhere near San Jose. And they had a garden, and they had all this stuff, and they just raised it, just flattened it out. And you're like, it doesn't even like jive with your argument of like getting people out because they're making a mess and they're doing all these terrible things. They had a freaking garden that they were maintaining.
They're growing vegetables. If this was a farmer's market,
sustaining plant life. I mean, and it all is coming down to perception. And I think that's what really always strikes me when you do hear new talk on the news or in the media about homelessness. It's often about the subtext is, how do we not see this problem? How do we, like you say, disappear it? They need to not be reminded of that this exists.
Yeah.
So I'm going to transition us. I think this is kind of related. I loved when you talked about that movie, A Certain Kind of Death, because I have also seen that movie more times than I care to admit on a podcast. That movie, there is something so compelling about it. And so maybe tell us about that movie. Maybe some of our listeners don't have the same proclivities that we have.
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's called Death by 1,000 Viewings, and I have not actually watched 1,000 times. I probably watched it like 25 to 30. I bought the DVD off of Amazon for like $100 because I couldn't find it. I was only watching it on YouTube. It is so compelling, and it's also so problematic. I think there's so much good about it and so much wrong with it at the same time. And it's really hard to unpack. I think it's fascinating, I think, especially for someone like myself, again, has been very, especially when I started watching it, lightly touched by death and had not seen it so viscerally and up close as you do in that film, right? You see dead bodies in major decomp situations, and you just see this hidden side of death and who's finding those people and who's then having to handle those people, and the whole like county and the government agencies that are managing that when that happens. And I think what's really interesting about it, that the more I thought about this film, there are three people that they follow, or 3 people who've died that they sort of follow throughout. And the first one, Ronald Eugene Tanner, gets the most airtime. And when I started thinking about that, I think partly it is because he's more accessible to people who
he's kind of like a middle class guy.
He is not homeless. He had his plot already paid for. He had everything laid out. He clearly knew he was dying. He had stuff there for people to find. Versus Donald, who was homeless and was just taking respite in a motel, and then Tommy, who was living in a single occupancy room, was clearly very poor, and they had very little money. And so it's really these different kind of rungs, right, of this. And you can't even say poverty, because I don't think like Ronald wasn't in poverty necessarily. He certainly wasn't well off, but he had a house and he had some things. But it's this. I think it's what a lot of times, and you see this in media, and I think in society, what we might call, quote, a bad death. And the more I have thought about this over time, and the problems, one is, and then I think I talked about this in the book, is they may not have actually been all that bad. I think, in fact, Ronald wanted to die the way he did because he clearly had the means. He had the to do all the, he had those paperwork out. Had he wanted to go to a hospital, had he wanted to go into like hospice or something, he probably could have.
Yeah. And didn't his partner die of AIDS?
Yeah. And I can't remember now if it had been some time.
It had been some time.
It had been some time.
Sure. And I was thinking about that when I was rereading your chapter on it. Was like, well, how did that impact how he wanted to die? And
totally.
Who are we to say? Yeah.
Yeah. And as I was, watching this film, I think what compelled me so much was that it was kind of my first entrance really into seeing things like that so up close. And it was almost like a desensitization ritual. The more I watch this, the less I cry. I cry a little bit less, but I'm still so impacted by it. And even that music and there's all these things that the filmmakers are doing to create a narrative that are getting you to feel a certain way. And I think about that. I think about this article called The Lonely Death of George Bell, which is this amazing article. But again, it's problematic because I think the problem is, I think these filmmakers are putting a certain perspective, like we said, on these deaths, and that maybe they weren't bad for these people. Maybe this was how, and we don't know. And so, but because of the way I think collectively our societies think about death and what's a good one and what's a bad one, I think oftentimes people think dying alone is inherently bad. And I think there's some judgment on there as well. Well, they might not have been great people, or they were weirdos, or whatever. There's something wrong. Yeah,
no one was there for them.
No one was there for them. And and there's another great article. I'm going to completely fail the name, but it's Andrew Kelleher, and I can find this stuff later if anyone wants it. But it's called Dying Old. But not, and it was something about basically his theory was, again, not everybody needs or wants to die with someone there. That some people actively withdraw from society and choose to, and like you said, who knows if this guy's partner's death played a role in that or whatever else. And I think the other problem that comes up with this, and it wasn't something I thought about probably for the first 10 times I watched it, but eventually it did start thinking, who's giving permission to film these people in death?
Yeah,
Yeah. And legally, they were, quote, wards of the state at this point, right? But it's a big gray zone. There is no one else to ask. And so you're just making that choice to do that with or without permission. And I think that is where that also makes me uncomfortable as a writer and as an artist, because sometimes you just, to do what you're trying to do, you make choices.
Yeah, right, you're right.
It feels like, I haven't seen it. I'm going to watch it, but it feels like at the very least, the filmmakers could have maybe contributed some funeral funds or something to these people in exchange for the permission to film them at the end of life.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know. And what's so fascinating about this film to me too is that, I tried so hard to find these filmmakers, it's like they're not real people.
Wow.
I can't
That's
find
weird.
anything. And I'm like, God, this is so meta. It's like hidden within hidden within hidden. It's like, God, we are really into obscurity here. When I bought the DVD, the one golden nugget I got was that there were some questions and answers at the end. And I can't remember them now to save my life. But like, that was the closest I got to hearing from the filmmakers. And I should go back and look at those because I don't remember what they said.
That movie, I don't know if you guys were into this kind of stuff in high school, but we used to rent Faces of Death. Do you remember that?
I remember those.
Which is like a teenage ritual for kids who are maybe getting into trouble. We used to go, you could only get it from Tower Records, and somebody had to be like 21 to rent it, but like whatever, they rented it to us. And that film is terrible, right? Like that was before the internet, before you could see any of that stuff. That film was just like, we would rent it just to like scream and hang on to our boyfriends. But this movie has like a little bit of that in it, like where it's not, I would say it's not as like prurient, but like there's this kind of like the fact that we can't find the filmmakers anywhere. It's kind of weird, right? Like,
wow.
It has like this kind of, I don't know, like it was meant, like nobody wants to own it or, I don't know. I just thought about that, how that was like kind of a taboo thing to do would be to watch that movie. And it was like porn. You had to get it from behind the counter and all this, right? And then now you have this movie, which we are in the digital age now. You can watch it on YouTube, or that's where I saw it.
That's where I found it.
We don't know who made that movie.
You know who made it. Yeah. You got the names.
Okay.
And, but what I couldn't find was any like the website or like contact information. There might have been a website that was very like limited in what was on it.
But they're maybe not making any more movies.
Yeah, and I feel like my memory is failing me now. I feel like I might have seen something where they had directed other films, but it was they just felt unreachable.
Yeah.
It's and maybe I didn't try hard enough, maybe I can try again. It would be very interesting.
Maybe this is a mystery that we all need to solve together.
Oh my God.
It's cursed.
It's been interesting as you've been talking though. It's like there's this element of like hide it away, right?
Yeah.
Like hide these people away, hide death. Like don't think about the fact that we're all gonna die. Yet there's all this voyeurism to parallel
it's
that.
voyeuristic.
It's super voyeuristic.
Like, I don't want to think about it. Like move these people away from me, move that cemetery away from me. But maybe I want to watch like a documentary of somebody dying that they don't have permission for.
It's sort of the Victorian approach. Don't think of sex. Don't think of sex. Don't think of sex. That's all everyone is thinking about.
They're telling on themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know what I was gonna say though is, and maybe I saw this in those questions and answers. I can't remember, but I saw something somewhere where as hidden as this is in a way. I mean, granted, it's just there on YouTube to find, but I'm not sure actually a lot of people know of its existence. I mean, it's also really old now. It's like almost 20 years old, over 20 years old, but. There was something about how the public administrators and the folks that they were highlighting that were working in the county and helping were so excited to have them film because they wanted people to see the work that they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those people were they had a lot of compassion.
Yeah.
They did their jobs very diligently. I thought that was actually one of the like things that surprised me about that movie was when I watched it was that like these county people were really diligently trying to identify these people, get their estates settled. It wasn't just like, throw it in a file and forget about it. They cared.
Right. And I think that, and that's why I say too, I think we all make jokes about the government, especially like, you're trying to get a permit from the city. Good luck, right? But that there are actually people in there doing good work and trying to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And I think, it's important. And so in that sense, I think that film does a good job of showing but there's also like there's just certain scenes where again I feel like it's they're telling a certain story, you know. And there's a scene toward the end where they're in the morgue and the guy just has this like giant, you know, knife, I don't know what you call that, and he's just slicing into the bag to like release the fluids before. And I'm thinking this is all very like there's a narrative, there's a perspective here.
Yeah.
Well, and counter to that, I was just thinking, Amy, of our friend Evie King and her book, Ashes to Admin. She is a worker in the UK government who helps figure out burial disposition, wrapping up of affairs for people who die unclaimed. And her book is very lovely. Like she takes a lot of time and effort and compassion to try to make sure that these people have the best death that they possibly can. And it reminds me a little bit of those county workers who are like, we're actually trying to do a good job here.
And a counter to that film too is one called The Potter's Field by Edward Heavrin, and that's also one you can get on YouTube. And I was able to talk to him, and I worked with him on some stuff. And he highlights the two county cemeteries, or the county cemeteries in Kentucky, outside like in Louisville. But his whole film is about the private schools there. There were some boys and girls, like in I think high school, who would go and hold memorial services for anyone who died and was buried in there. And so it was showing like how and I think that is a really good example of how community can get involved in some kind of way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually about that. You were talking earlier about Fresno, and there are at least occasional memorial services for people who die in these conditions. Do you think that memorials like that are good and necessary and important, and why? I'll just say San Francisco does not do this. They cremate the unclaimed dead and they scatter them under the Golden Gate Bridge without any formal ceremony for the public. So
Yes, I do think it's important. I think it's incredibly important. And it's funny because I had a Seattle Times reporter reach out to me a couple months ago because she had found out a town in Washington was doing this. And I hated to burst her bubble, but she's like, do all other places do this? And I'm like, from what I can tell, and granted, I haven't spent time researching everywhere, this feels like less the norm than not. But I think it is important. And I think what I said is that I don't care if you knew these people or not. We need, as community, to mourn and memorialize the people who have died and been a part of our community, even if we didn't see them. They still hold value. And it's that same, like going back to that quote of how you treat your dead. You show respect and you give some kind of memorialization. If it is a ritual, and this is how we start to care. This is how we care about other people, even when we don't know them or don't share the same experiences, by having that shared time to do that. And sadly, Fresno no longer does that. As we found out, they quietly stopped that after 2018, and they now ship them up here to Marin County to go out to sea.
Where there's nobody local to grieve them at all.
Nope. And from what I can understand, they hold records for a year and then no more. And Fresno doesn't hold any records once they come up here. So what happens when you're trying to look for some? And I haven't fully verified that, so I'll qualify that with I'm not entirely sure, but if that's what I'm understanding, I'm really struggling to figure out how someone finds somebody even a few years later.
Yeah.
And again, it's like we're just literally then are we just actually treating people like trash?
Yeah. And Amy, I really think this goes, like all of this goes back to this like continuum of failure. And also like the idea of ritualizing and memorializing people as a community that we maybe didn't know or didn't see or are technically unclaimed is giving people an idea that these people are around, right? Like it is maybe creating some space for empathy along that continuum. People always say to me, and Beth, I'm sure you both get this all the time. It's like, well, who cares? They're dead. Like, who cares? They're dead. And it's like, well, you didn't care when they were alive either. That's the problem. So like we, the four of us, are in our lane, right? Which is we're interested in how these things show up in death and how we as a culture think about this. But like, there was no care in life either. And so by starting to care, if it's an avenue for you to care by coming in at death, then that's maybe a way for you to care about them when they're alive and here in front of you.
I also think it helps normalize death a little bit more too when we say, hey, let's all show up for these memorial services and have those rituals around them. It creates a space where you can enter into death in a way maybe you weren't comfortable with.
Yeah, and into communion with your fellow citizens.
Also, if I can say, I think, as an individual, if you say, I don't care what happens to me when I'm dead, that's fine. And that's a privilege that you have if you don't care.
Yep. And it's a privilege you have if you have the ability to dictate what happens to your remains after you're dead, right? Like when we talked about, something that still happens with like the tissue trade and things. And I don't know if it's still true, but there was a county in Texas that was essentially, if you died unclaimed, your remains could go to a tissue broker, right? Body broker.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tell people this, I will often hear something along the lines of, well, they're dead, who cares? And it's like, yeah, you might not care because that's not your grandma getting cut up for parts and sent all over the United States, right? Because it won't happen to you.
Right.
You might care if it was a possibility.
I have found that there are plenty of people who say, I don't care what happens to me when I die, but they will have strong feelings about their loved ones and what happens to them when they die.
Yes, that's a good point.
This is why people need to write down something that they want to happen, because otherwise your family is going to wind up fighting over it, and that's not a good legacy to leave for them. Yeah, and that's probably a rant for another day. But really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't have strong feelings about yourself. As soon as you have strong feelings about someone else, I think that's the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true. Yeah.
Because they're gone, but you might want to go somewhere to grieve them, or you might want a specific monument or something written down, because you're still living with the grief of them being gone. That's what it's for.
It's not for the dead person.
It's for the living.
I think it's funny, like Robin Hemley in this essay he wrote for the Inevitable, he talks about like the different levels of dead, and there's the truly dead, which are the long forgotten hundreds of years later. And so he says, I'm gonna preempt all that, and I'm gonna say I don't want anything on a headstone. I want it blank. And like, again, that's your privilege, buddy, because maybe someone else's loved ones or someone doesn't want to be in a cemetery where all there is a cement slab with a number etched in with a stick, or taken to sea with no ceremony and no record of their death. Not everybody wants that. And so that's great if that's what you want. Write it down.
Yeah.
Right.
Just leave a little bit of information for your loved ones.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for talking with us. This has been so good to talk about all of this stuff. And I wanted to ask you, how can people find out more about you and your work and your upcoming events?
And equitable disposition.
Yes.
Too.
Yes. So all of that. The first thing is my website, which is Amy S. Shea. So there are 2 S's there.
Shea.
Yeah, because Amy Shea was already taken.
Darn it.
I know. And technically my maiden name also started with an S. Anyway, so amyshea.com is my website, and that will have everything about the book, everything about all the events happening. I'm also very active on Instagram, and that's Amy Shea _author. Everything is there. And the Equitable Disposition Alliance is also that. I think all that's mentioned. I'm just looking at, it's just equitabledisposition.org is the website.
And we'll put it all in the show notes so that listeners can see that.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's there. And we are still looking for volunteers to help us fill in that database. That I think we have about 20 we have like half the states we need. So we're still trying to fill in more of those gaps. So yeah.
Do you have a list on the website of states that still need volunteers?
No, but we have just a form you can fill in and say, I'm interested. And then our project manager will reach out and kind of hook people up. And because we're also at this point, it's like, I don't think you need to necessarily live in the state you're researching. You just need to be able to call someone and ask.
Good to know. Thank you again. It's been great to talk with you.
Yeah, it was so lovely. I really appreciate it.
Everyone should get Amy's book when I think it's out now by the time of this publication.
Yeah. Again, do you want to say the name of the book?
Yes, it's Too Poor to Die, The Hidden Realities of Dying in the Margins.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. It was so great to talk to you.
Same.
Dead Reckoning, the podcast where death isn't the end of the story. Hosted by Courtney Minnick and Beth Weingartner. Produced by Carolyn Kissick and Here Lies a Story. With art design by Dante Silliman. Our music is Act Calm by OTE. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Dead Reckoning on your favorite podcast platform or email us at show@deadreckoningpodcast.com. You can follow Courtney at Here Lies a Story on Instagram and at Courtney Minnick on Blue Sky and see more of her work at herelisastory.com. You can follow Beth at Beth Weingartner on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Mastodon and see more of her work at bethweingartner.com.